Bastard nothing. That's what my father bellowed across the American Legion Hall before he paraded his real daughter, the child of his new wife. The room went quiet. Forks froze. I didn't argue. I stepped outside, opened my trunk, and stared at the one thing I swore I'd never use for a family fight, my dress blues. I'm Major General Daniel Mercer, United States Marine Corps. 2 silver stars don't make you right, but they don't lie either. I went back in, heels on tile, buttons catching the light, and the real daughter, a young Marine from Quantico who'd only ever seen my signature on orders, looked up, went pale, and screamed, "Oh my God, that's my general." If you've ever been cut down by your own blood, stay with me. In the next few minutes, you'll see why she didn't recognize her commanding general until the uniform made the truth undeniable. How the very next workday I removed myself from any case touching her and handed it to the Inspector General because revenge is easy, integrity isn't. And how a man who spit on his son at a wedding had to correct himself out loud where everyone could hear it. This isn't a brawl. It's a reckoning. No shouting match, no cheap payback, just the kind of clean fight the Corps taught me. Stand your ground, let the facts stand taller. Watch to the end and you'll hear the one sentence he finally said in public, the only one that mattered. I'm Jack Mercer, 55, a Major General in the United States Marine Corps. I came up hard out of West Texas, earned my commission the slow way, and now command training at Quantico. I don't raise my voice, and I don't use a uniform to win family arguments until the night my father made sure the whole room heard what he thought I was worth. You've already heard the words he chose and how the hall went still. Here's what you didn't see. The American Legion Hall in Fredericksburg held maybe 100 folks under fluorescent lights and paper streamers. The DJ had been cycling old country tunes, the kind you hear through tinny speakers at VFW fish fries. There was the soft clink of forks on disposable plates, the sweet and sour mix of barbecue sauce and Budweiser. And then my father lifted his glass and pointed. Denise, his new wife, stood beside him with a smile that was more lacquer than warmth. Her daughter, Ashley, pink dress, too much blush young in a way that makes you hope someone older is nearby to steer, absorbed the attention. She works admin at a satellite office tied to Quantico. She'd seen my initials on orders, nothing more. Around home, some cousins still used my mother's last name when they talked about me, Hale. So Ashley never connected the signature to the man in the back of the hall. I didn't answer him. I left by the side door into the muggy Virginia evening and called an old friend, Major General Sam Ortiz, retired. He didn't ask what happened. He listened, then said what good Marines say when the powder is dry and the blood is up: keep it clean, let the truth stand on its own legs. I sat in my car and looked at the garment bag I'd tossed into the trunk out of habit that morning. I've always believed the uniform belongs to the Corps, not to family quarrels. But sometimes the only way not to fight dirty is to show up exactly as you are. I put on the blue dress coat in the cramped light of the dome lamp, buttoned it without hurry, checked ribbons by touch more than sight, and slid on the polished shoes. When I went back in, I removed my cover at the threshold and felt the familiar weight on my shoulders. 2 stars that don't entitle a man to much beyond responsibility. The DJ had cut the music. You can tell when a room regains its hearing. It's there in the hiss of the air conditioner and the way whispers stop pretending to be whispers. A gray-haired veteran at the end table tapped a challenge coin once against plastic, a small metallic note that carried farther than you'd think. A few old Marines straightened in their seats. No salutes, this wasn't a parade deck, just a quiet tightening of spines. My father's mouth closed, but his jaw didn't soften. Denise's smile stayed, but thinner. Ashley turned, expecting another compliment, and her gaze climbed the coat to the medal that marks the job. The color drained out of her face as comprehension caught up with her memory of a signature. When her hand trembled, she wasn't holding a glass anymore. She was a lance corporal who had just recognized her commanding general. I didn't speak to my father. I addressed the room and kept it short because that's what duty and age teach you to do. Matters of work belong at the office. Tonight belongs to family. Then I stepped back toward the door as the hall exhaled and folks decided whether to look at their plates or at me. The coin lay quiet on the table again. The truth was standing. It didn't need a second tap. The door settled behind me and the heat of the lot pressed close, the kind that holds the day's breath a little too long. Headlights skimmed the gravel, somebody laughed too loudly by the row of pickups, and then a hand found my elbow. Jack June said, voice soft but steady. You don't owe anyone a scene. She was 71 and still had the quick eyes of a woman who'd spent a lifetime reading rooms before trouble arrived. I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me but let it stand, just squeezed once and stayed at my shoulder like a flag that doesn't flap unless it has to. People trickled out in twos and threes, unsure whether to meet my eye. A Vietnam vet in a cap shook my hand and said nothing, which was the right choice. A cousin I barely knew muttered that the air was thick tonight. Then Denise drifted close, pretending to check her phone while angling an ear toward us. He'd had too much, she offered, not looking up. He doesn't mean half of what he says when folks pour his glass for him. I told her this is family, not a courtroom. She nodded as if she had been waiting for permission to put something down. He sent money, you know, quietly, years of it. June handled it so Maggie would take it. June's chin dipped a fraction, not denial, not pride, just the truth set where it belonged. I let it sit. No tally, no argument. If help has strings, the strings make more noise than the help. Denise seemed to understand she'd said too much and stepped back toward the door, her face arranged into the smile she wears when the DJ turns up the volume. Ashley came out alone, shoulders tight as if bracing for the first gust after a storm. She is 23, young enough to want every sign to be clear and old enough to know most aren't. Sir, she said, voice small but not evasive. I didn't know. I kept my tone even. Monday 0800. Bring every receipt, every voucher, everything you signed. Tell the truth, follow your chain of command. She nodded once the way a young Marine does when the hard part isn't the order, but living with the echo of it. Yes, sir. She started to turn, then stopped. Thank you for not. She couldn't finish, and she didn't have to. We shook hands as Marines, not as props in a family drama. And she went back inside to help her mother cut cake neither of them wanted. When the lot thinned, I sat in the car long enough for the dome light to time out. The coat went on a hanger hook so it wouldn't crease, not paraded, not displayed. My phone showed a missed call and a voicemail from a local number I knew better than to ignore. I listened once. My father's voice wandered as if he were walking a dark house, careful not to bump the furniture. He said he'd gone too far. He said there were reasons, old ones, that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with people who had been dead long enough to stop bossing the living. He said he didn't know what to do next. I let the message end without replay. Some things you acknowledge without rewarding. I started the engine and watched the temperature needle move, then pulled onto Route 3 and aimed for a single-story motor court that's still rented by the night. I could have driven to base and signed into transient lodging, but I wasn't on orders and I don't use government beds to sleep off family noise. The clerk slid a registration card across scuffed laminate and asked if I needed a wake-up call. I told him no. My name went on the line in block letters, a habit that never leaves you, and I took the key with the big plastic fob that rattled like a child's toy. The room smelled of bleach and last week's dust. I set the phone on the table, covered the little red eye of the television with a corner of the notepad, and sat for a long minute with the air unit wobbling between cool and loud. There are lines you draw for yourself, and there are lines you draw so other people can't pretend they didn't see them. Tonight's line was simple. Tomorrow would be about the book, not about me. At 0800, she would bring what needed bringing, and the process that outlives all of us would begin to do its quiet work. Outside, a truck downshifted at the light, the kind of sound that says the world keeps moving whether or not a man has the words to keep up. I turned out the lamp and let the dark settle like a well-made bed. Sleep didn't come quickly, and when it did, it pulled me backward to the place where a boy starts deciding what kind of man he's going to be. West Texas is wide and windy, and the house I grew up in rattled when a front pushed through. My mother Maggie worked nights at a plant that baked the smell of oil and bleach into her clothes. She'd come home near dawn, loosen the laces on her shoes, and sit a minute before the sun woke the neighborhood. My father Hal came and went. Sometimes he showed with a joke and a plan, sometimes not at all. So I got up early and found a paper route, folded the Lubbock Avalanche Journal tight so it would fly to the porch. In the summer I mowed and raked. In the winter I chipped ice. If something needed doing, I did it and kept my mouth shut about it. At 18, I signed the enlistment papers and did what kids from my street did when they wanted distance and a chance. I joined the Marine Corps. I wasn't a natural at anything except showing up. That turned out to be enough. A first sergeant I respected told me about MESEP, the program that would put a degree within reach if I carried my weight. I did. Classes by day, duty by night, a slow stack of credits that finally made a whole. By the time I reported to officer candidate school at Quantico, I was 26, going on older. I had learned how to keep pace and how to keep quiet. Neither helps much when a letter lands like a brick. It came in the middle of a week when the rain turned the trails to paste and our legs were lead. My name on the envelope in my father's hand. Inside was a sentence and a half telling me I wasn't officer material and never would be, that I was pretending in a suit that didn't belong to me. I carried the letter folded flat in my breast pocket and felt it like a coin that burned. I knew how to endure. I didn't know right then why to. On the third night, an instructor found me alone on the catwalk above the squad bay, watching candidates sleep like cordwood. He wasn't a talker. He stood there long enough to make it clear he wasn't leaving. Then he asked if it was going to be the letter or the work that decided who I was. I told him I didn't see the difference. He said the line I've never needed to improve on. Honor doesn't need a father's signature. He left me to consider it without an audience. In the morning, I put the letter with the trash. OCS ended the way hard things end, without confetti. I went to my first set of orders at Camp Lejeune on the logistics side. It's not a glamorous lane, but it's the one that gets people in gear where they need to be, and that matters more than how it looks. I learned convoy math, the ugly arithmetic of gallons and miles, and how to make a plan sturdy enough to survive contact with weather and human nature. Okinawa taught me humidity you can drink and patience you can't fake. Iraq taught me that routes change after sunset, and that quiet voices carry farthest on bad days. On one of those days, a young officer's vehicle took a hit outside Fallujah and stalled in a spot that didn't forgive second tries. We moved fast and wrong at first, then right, and we pulled his people out and pushed the convoy through. He pressed a challenge coin into my hand. Later, not as a ceremony, just a thank you. He didn't know how else to say. It stayed with me because it was earned the old way, in dust and noise, not in a conference room. I carried it forward to Afghanistan and then back stateside to Quantico, where I put on a different kind of miles, teaching others to do the job without breaking themselves or what they're responsible for. Somewhere along the road, the rank followed. You don't chase stars, you shoulder them when they land. The style that got me there isn't complicated. Show up, write it down, say less than you're thinking. Keep faith with the plan you published and the people you asked to follow it. If you're lucky, you get to hand that steadiness to the next set of hands. The coin rides in my pocket, still smooth now from years of palms. I don't flash it in bars. I don't talk about the day I got it unless someone needs the reason behind the rule. It reminds me that a life can be built out of steady choices, and that the loudest thing you do doesn't have to be your voice. Morning came the way it does on base, with the hum of an early running mower and the first flag flapping itself awake over the parade field. I drove through the main gate at Quantico before the coffee in my travel mug cooled, and parked where I always do, a slot no one else chooses because the sidewalk there pitches water at your shoes after rain. At 0800 on the dot, I was in my conference room with two people whose jobs exist to keep leaders from stepping on the rake. Colonel Evan Price, our staff judge advocate, set a slim folder on the table and waited. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Lane, Inspector General, carried a stenopad and a pen. She clicks only when she's about to ask a hard question. We didn't waste time. I said, "We'll do this by the book." Price slid me a recusal memo drafted in plain English, the kind that survives sunlight. It stated that any matter touching Lance Corporal Ashley Carter would be screened from my decision-making, that all findings, interviews, and recommendations would run through the IG and SJA, and that I would receive read-only updates sufficient to maintain command awareness without influence. Lane confirmed her team had already established a firewall. I read every line, asked 2 clarifying questions about the routing chain, and signed. Price had a redacted version ready to release if our public affairs office needed to explain the process. He asked what I wanted them to say. Process only, I told him. No names, no commentary, no timelines that could point to a person. If anyone asks about me, the answer is, I'm recused and the system works the way it's supposed to. Lane outlined her next steps in the tempo she uses when a room is listening. Notify Ashley's immediate supervisor, conduct document review, confirm travel claims against orders, and schedule interviews. I told her I didn't need or want to know the scheduling details. She nodded once. The meeting ended in less than 20 minutes because good guardrails don't take long to build if you keep the hardware handy. From there, I walked the passageway that links our admin wing to the training offices. My aide caught up and asked whether I wanted a written reminder pushed to the staff. I dictated it in a sentence he could memorize: "We follow the book." He sent it out under my signature before we reached the stairwell. At the far end of the corridor, I heard the rap of knuckles on a door frame, the sound that makes Marines straighten even when the knock isn't for them. Inspector General, a voice announced. I didn't turn my head, but the next voice carried anyway. Ma'am, Ashley said, steady enough to be understood. I didn't know until the wedding. The IG team stepped inside. The door swung in and the latch caught. I kept walking, not because I didn't care, but because the line we drew an hour earlier meant caring and interfering were no longer allowed to touch. Back in my office, I reviewed the morning's training slides, checked the roster, and signed a stack of approvals that had waited through the weekend. When my public affairs officer came by with a draft sentence for potential inquiries, it matched what we'd agreed, described the process in general terms. Confirm the commander is recused and refer any further questions to the Inspector General's office. I initialed the margin and handed it back. Outside my window, a platoon trotted past in formation cadence, low and workable for a Monday. The work is the work. It doesn't accelerate for rumor and it doesn't stall for family. It wants you to be predictable. So I returned to being exactly that, a man whose job is to make sure the system outlasts our moods. The corridor stayed quiet after the door clicked shut behind the IG team, and that quiet carried through the morning like a posted order. By midday, Rachel Lane's people had fanned out along the administrative side of the house, knocking on the offices that own the paperwork. Before it ever reaches a general's desk, they started where you always start, at the top of the immediate chain. An interview with the officer in charge of Ashley's section. Then the staff non-commissioned officer who runs the day-to-day, and finally the admin clerk who lives inside the systems that turn travel into numbers. Questions were precise and boring in the way that keeps people honest: which orders authorized, which movement, which dates matched which receipts, who reviewed the defense travel system entries, when per diem started and stopped, how mileage was computed, why. A government travel card showed a meal charge on the same date a full per diem posted. Screenshots were printed and initialed. Receipts were photographed and returned. Nobody raised a voice. The findings didn't point to a scheme. They pointed to sloppiness and a young Marine trying to square away after the fact. 2 days overlapped where they shouldn't have per diem claimed for a travel day that had already been reimbursed on a previous itinerary. A mileage entry used the wrong rate by a few cents a mile because a drop-down field defaulted to the prior fiscal year. A hotel folio had been uploaded as a photo so blurred you could mistake a 6 for an 8, and the clerk approved it anyway. Lane's team bled the color out of each error until only the math remained. Along the way, they noted something else that mattered: the way Ashley had landed in that office. It wasn't a back door to rank or a seat she shouldn't have had. An old acquaintance of my father's, retired from federal service and still on the Legion's mailing list, had introduced Denise's daughter to the section chief when the unit needed a body who could type fast and didn't mind learning the travel software. Networking, not purchase. The note went in the file so the record would tell the whole story instead of the juiciest part of it. When the IG sat down with Ashley, she didn't spend any time on the introduction. She owned what was hers. She brought a handwritten statement that matched the documents, acknowledged the dates, and spelled out the mistakes without massaging them. She asked what it would take to make it right, and Lane told her repay the overage, complete remedial training on travel rules and government card use, accept formal counseling, and stop thinking of the system as a puzzle to solve after the trip instead of a plan to follow before it. That afternoon, a cashier's check covered the difference down to the penny. The next morning, her name showed on the roster for the unglamorous work Marines use when they need to sweat out a lesson: 400 chow hall setup, supply cage inventory, past lights out, and weekend police call that dots a field with orange vests. None of it looks good on a screen. All of it looks right in a logbook. I learned about the tempo the way a commander should when he's removed from the loop: a sealed packet marked for awareness, only couriered up the passageway and logged by my aide. Inside was an executive summary, timelines, exhibits, and a draft counseling entry for Ashley's supervisor to deliver. I read every page in one pass and resisted the impulse that tempts most leaders when they see a process working to add a sentence that doesn't belong. I initialed the receipt for the file, closed the folder, and set it in the safe until the next update arrived. Out on the grinder, recruits were calling cadence that doesn't care who embarrassed whom at a wedding. Inside, a young Marine was making the kind of payment that costs time and pride instead of headlines. The stakes were high enough to teach and low enough to keep a future. That's where accountability belongs when you want the institution to outlive the gossip. Afternoons are when the noise finds you. By midweek, a fresh account on a local social page threw a stone into a shallow pond. A post written like a dare and shared by people who like a good stir. General protects his own stepdaughter. Different rules for brass. The handle was new, the grammar familiar. Folks who spend evenings at the same bar my father favors recognize the voice behind it, even if the profile photo was a flag at half-staff. The allegation didn't bother with facts. It didn't need to. It counted on heat. Our public affairs officer knocked once and stepped in with a printout. She asked whether we should respond. We already had the answer. Process only, I said. And she had the language ready in a paragraph that could have come from any command in the country when matters touch potential misconduct. The Inspector General conducts independent fact-gathering. The staff judge advocate oversees compliance with law and policy. The commanding general has recused from any decision-making in this instance. Updates will be handled through established channels. She posted it on the base site where we keep policies nobody reads until they're needed. And she attached a redacted copy of the recusal memo. Fat black bars where names and dates live, one clean sentence visible enough to do the job the commander is recused. No names, no unit identifiers, no breadcrumbs for hobby sleuths. Then she closed her browser and went back to the media training schedule as if she'd just filed a weather report. That same afternoon, she stopped back in with a second sheet of paper. It was an email forwarded to her public inbox from Ashley's civilian address. I read it once. No favoritism requested, it said. Please do not identify me. I accept the process. That was the whole message. No pleading, no explanation. The PAO filed it with the other documents and did not quote it publicly. We didn't need a sympathetic voice. We needed the right one, and that voice speaks in checklists and routing stamps. The barroom account tried another round this time with a screenshot of the memo caption to make the black lines look like a cover-up. The comments went the way comments do for a few hours, hot and certain and vague. By evening, though, the temperature dropped. A former clerk from another base chimed in to say that a redacted memo means the opposite of what the caption claims. A retired sergeant major posted a dry note about how recusal protects everybody. A Navy spouse explained better than most officers would that procedure is what keeps neighbors from running the courthouse. Nothing I wrote, nothing I liked or shared, just the slow effect of unglamorous words doing their work. My phone buzzed with a text from Sam Ortiz that read like him and like the Corps at its best. Let the file speak, so we did. The IG kept at it. The SJA did the quiet lawyering that never trends. Public Affairs answered 2 more emails with the same paragraph pointing to the same page. The anonymous account kept posting smaller stones that made smaller ripples. People have lives and rumor wears thin when it can't change a calendar. On base, nothing sped up and nothing slowed down. Recruits still lost count on their push-ups and learned to find it again. In the admin shop, a civilian typist set a fresh toner cartridge and ran another batch of orders. In my office, I signed training approvals whose only drama was a hyphen out of place. The point of a system is that it outlasts the day's temperature. By the week's end, the loudest thing left of the accusation was the dry language of a public page that said, in effect, we know how to do this and we are doing it. I didn't call my father and I didn't visit that bar. Some lessons don't arrive by argument. They arrive when noise meets a wall that doesn't echo. And the wall in our line of work is a stack of procedures that guard everyone in the room, whether they're ready to be guarded or not. What happened next I learned later from June and from a man at the Legion who nursed one beer long enough to see the room change. By the time the posts online had cooled, my father had taken his usual stool under the TV that never quite fit the bracket. The game was on mute, the captions stumbling across the bottom. He was telling the story the way men do when they're trying to turn a bad page into a good joke. A veteran with a faded jump wings tattoo listened longer than most, and then put his glass down so it touched the bar with a small, deliberate sound. Hal, he said, not unkind, you want to win the bar or your conscience? The TV kept moving its lips. The line landed where the laughter had been. My father didn't answer. He folded his napkin once, then again, the kind of folding a man does when he needs his hands to behave while his head catches up. He paid, left the change, and stepped into the sort of evening that costs you nothing until you decide to spend it right. Aunt June was waiting at her kitchen table with a manila envelope that had been traveling the long way around a decision for years. She had the look of someone who has kept a confidence so long she's begun to forget it wasn't hers to keep. It's time, she told him, and pushed the envelope across the oilcloth. Inside was a letter he had written to my mother, Maggie, after a night when pride had come off like a coat and decency had found a pen. The date was old, the ink had browned. He had written that he knew I was his and was sorry for the ways he had tried to make the world believe otherwise. He had written that he would do better. Then, according to June, he had folded it, put a stamp on it, and never mailed it because someone in the family told him keeping face mattered more than making truth. He held the paper like it might break if he moved wrong. June poured coffee and didn't hurry him. "You've had reasons for a long time," she said, "but you're fresh out of excuses." He nodded without lifting his chin and slid the letter back into the envelope as if returning it to a drawer that no longer existed. Across town, Denise sat in her car outside the reception hall, hands on the wheel, though the engine was off. She typed, erased, and typed again before sending a message to Ashley that would read simply when the phone buzzed on Ashley's nightstand. "Do the right thing. Don't do what we grown-ups did. No names, no instructions, no scolding. Just a small push in the direction she wished someone had given her when choices looked easier in the moment than they proved to be in the years." My father drove home the slow way, stopping at every light even when the intersection was empty. In his living room, the ceremony pamphlet lay face down on the coffee table. He sat and fished his phone out of his pocket and played the voicemail he had left me 2 nights earlier. He listened to his own voice stumble through the sentences, the part where he said he'd gone too far. The part where he said old ghosts were doing the talking. He let it run to the end and didn't hit replay. Then he set the phone on the table and put the manila envelope beside it. He went to the sink and rinsed a glass and filled it with water like a man who knows the night has work for him and wants to get the simple tasks out of the way first. When he came back, he folded himself into the chair and looked at both objects, until the choice he had been postponing stopped pretending to be complicated. Pride had kept him moving his lips at a bar. Paper had kept his apology in a drawer. Neither one had done a lick of good. He reached for the phone again and scrolled through contacts until he landed on June. He told her he needed to see me. She told him the diner on Route 17 still brewed coffee that could straighten a man's back if he sat with it long enough. He said he didn't know what to say. She told him he didn't have to talk first. He had to show up. He set the time, put the envelope in a clean grocery bag, and placed the bag by the door so he couldn't pretend to forget it in the morning. Then he turned off the lamp and sat in the dark with the quiet kind that isn't punishment but preparation. I was there first in a booth that let me watch the door and the highway in the same glance. The place was the kind of diner that has never learned how to be anything else, chrome trim scratched by 1,000 keys, coffee poured from a pot that is seen every hour on a clock. A waitress who calls everyone home because it saves time. I kept my cover in the car, ordered black coffee, and counted the trucks shouldering past the window, until my father walked in with a paper bag folded tight at the top. He stood at the end of the table long enough for the waitress to set another cup and then slid in across from me. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need the lie that would come with it. He tried a smile that didn't fit, glanced at the bag, and cleared his throat. I told him we could keep it simple. You don't have to love me, but don't lie in public. He looked older than he had 2 nights before, as if the bark had slipped and showed the soft underlayer men spend years pretending isn't there. "I went too far," he said, voice aiming for steady and missing. I didn't answer that either. He reached for the bag and eased out a manila envelope, the kind that remembers each fold. He laid it on the table and nudged it toward me with 2 fingers. "I wrote this a long time ago," he said. "I should have sent it." I kept my hands still. Truth doesn't need paper. He blinked once, twice, the way a man does when he expected to buy his way out with stationery. The envelope stayed between us like a placemat no one ordered. The waitress came back with a top off and a plate of toast she hadn't asked about because toast makes conversations behave. My father wrapped both hands around his cup and stared into the heat. He talked about how people tell you there's time to fix things and how that stops being true one day when you realize no one is promising you another try. I let him speak until the words lost their hurry. I told him there are two kinds of repair. The kind you want credit for and the kind you do in the right place with the right words. A wedding toast is not that place. An introduction that tells the truth where it counts is. He nodded, and the nod said he understood the difference even if he didn't like it. He asked if there was anything else he should do. I told him to stop explaining himself to people who clap for a story that isn't theirs. If he meant to correct what he'd said, he needed to say it where ears had heard him wrong. He could decide when and how. He tried to push the envelope again. I slid the check toward me instead. The waitress had drawn a smiley face in blue ink over the total, a mercy some days and a nuisance others. I set down cash and turned the paper over. Respect isn't owed, it's earned. I wrote it neat the way my instructors taught me to fill blocks so nobody could pretend they misread what they didn't like. He watched the pen move and looked away before I finished. I stood and left the cash under the edge of the mug so it wouldn't wander. He stayed seated, both palms flat on the formica, as if the table might slide out from under him. I didn't touch his shoulder or the envelope. At the door, the bell made its tired note, and the highway answered with a freight horn a mile off. Outside, the wind had come up, the kind that scrubs a sky clean without asking whether you're ready to see it that way. I walked to the car and drove back toward base, where rooms have doors that close and rules that keep a man from mistaking sentiment for duty. The coffee sat warm in my chest and steadier than anything we'd said. There are meetings you hold so the next one can happen. This was that meeting. The rest would live or die on whether a man chose the right room to tell the right truth. The diner coffee was still in my throat the next morning when the band began to tune on the parade deck. Quantico wears ceremony well. The field was chalked clean, flags posted along the perimeter, bleachers filling with families who ironed their best for a weekday. A breeze came off the river and snapped the colors to attention before anyone else had to. I checked the order of events with the adjutant, nodded to the drum major, and took my place at the lectern as the formation dressed its lines. When the colors marched on, the band settled into the anthem with the steadiness you only get from repetition. Outdoors, the salute is as much habit as honor. Hands went up in a moving wave until the last note held and fell. The narrator read the orders in the same measured cadence Marines have heard for generations, who relinquishes, who assumes effective dates authority cited. The outgoing commander stepped forward, received quiet thanks. The incoming took his place, accepted the guidon, and passed it back with the small economy of motion that tells you he understands who owns it. My remarks were short on purpose. Training is a promise, not a speech, and the Marines standing in the sun had miles to go before the day turned them loose. I thanked the families for loaning us their people. I reminded the regiment of the standard: do the common things uncommonly well. Keep faith with the plan you published. Leave your replacements a cleaner deck than you found. I said the work here is simple to say and hard to do, and that our measure is whether the units we send forward trust what we taught them when it's dark and the map looks wrong. Then I stepped back and let the ceremony breathe. Ashley stood with her section in the admin element, second file, chin level, eyes front. She had the look young Marines wear when they've already had a long week and intend to make it through another. Reporting as ordered isn't just a phrase. It's a posture that begins in the feet and works its way through the rest of you until your thoughts keep pace. If she saw me glance that direction once, it didn't show. She kept her bearing and let the sequence carry her. The families did what families do, whispered names, aimed phones, blinked away grit. Behind the last row, a man in a sport coat that had seen better shoulders paused at the edge of the crowd and measured the distance to the gate like someone deciding whether to take a walk he hadn't planned. My father had come alone. He stood there long enough to feel the awkwardness tighten, then slid a hand into his pocket. Later, someone told me they saw him look down, thumb and forefinger worrying a coin as if a smooth circle could steady a rough thought. He didn't pull it out. He didn't need a prop. He just stayed there with the music in his chest and decided not to leave. The pass in review rolled by on schedule guides locked on the line heels. Striking a tempo the band matched and made better. When the last platoon cleared the corner and the drumline cut, the field felt bigger for a breath, the way it always does after movement stops. I presented the meritorious masts that were due. Shook hands, I meant, and let the protocol officer shepherd the families toward the photo spots where sunlight is kinder. From the podium steps, I could see details that don't make programs: a child tracing the stitching on a campaign streamer with a single finger, a corporal coaching his parents on which side of the ribbon rack to stand, an old Marine answering a grandchild's question with a story he'd pared down to fit the space between songs. Near the back rail, my father shifted his weight and took off his cap. He didn't wave. He didn't call. He stood straight when the colors retired and put the cap back on without looking around to see who noticed. That's sometimes all a man needs to decide the next right thing, enough quiet to hear himself choose. When the band cased their instruments and the formations were dismissed, the deck returned to being a field again. I signed the last certificate and handed the pen to the adjutant. The day had given every person present the same gift: a clear place to stand. The rest of it, the words that ought to be said and where to say them, would take care of themselves if a man chose the proper room. Families drifted toward the photo spots and the band was packing horns when the adjutant touched my sleeve and murmured that someone from admin sought permission to approach. I nodded, and the petty choreography of a parade deck made a lane. A lance corporal stepped out from her section with the crisp economy that comes from practice, halted 2 paces off and set her heels. "Lance Corporal Ashley Carter reporting as ordered, sir." Her voice carried just far enough. I returned what was due, no more and no less. "Carry on." She acknowledged with a clean eye, sir, pivoted and rejoined her line. No sidebar, no aside, only a professional exchange in a public place that belongs to the work, not to anyone's story. The breeze tugged the edge of the colors. The last stroller wheel thumped over a cable mat. The field began to shed ceremony and turn back into grass. That's when I saw him step from the shade of the bleachers into the open lane that still lay between the stands and the deck. He moved like a man who didn't want to block anyone's sightline, head uncovered, coat buttoned wrong by one, the small mistakes that tell on nerves. He stopped at the boundary where civilians pause and decide whether to close the distance. For a breath he stayed there, looking at the guidon now cased, at the families, at the Marines stacking chairs in unison. Then he crossed to the rail where the protocol officer stood watch. "May I?" my father asked, not loud enough for anyone but the lieutenant and me to hear. The lieutenant glanced at my face. I gave him nothing but a slight nod. My father walked the last few yards on the deck that was a field again and came to a halt at arm's length. He didn't lift his chin. He didn't try to explain what couldn't be fixed by explaining. He offered his hand. "My son, Major General Jack Mercer." 4 words set like a cornerstone. The distance between us changed shape without moving. Somewhere behind him, a gray head inclined. A coin clicked against a palm just once, the bright note of respect that says enough without asking for more. A few claps answered it, the kind of sound people make when they feel something land true and don't want to bruise it by getting greedy. "Thank you," I said, because courtesy is a form of truth when you use it right. We shook hands. No performance. No second sentence. He released his grip, first stepped back half a pace, and gave me the small nod men in our part of the country use when they mean to put their name on a thing and keep it there. The protocol officer took that as his cue to open the lane again. Marines threaded through with chairs and trash bags, families queued for pictures with the retiring commander. And a little boy in a too-big cover saluted the flag case as it passed, because a grandfather bent down and showed him how. I walked the perimeter with the sergeant major, thanked the band, signed the last certificate, and handed the pen to a corporal who would ferry it back to the office where pens go to wait their turn. When I looked back toward the bleachers, my father had already moved to the outer path where the shade returns sooner. He didn't wave. He didn't linger. He put his cap on at the sidewalk and kept going, a man with just enough daylight left to use it right. Ashley's section broke down their area and fell out by squads. She didn't look over. She didn't need to. The exchange we'd had was the right size for the moment, and the moment belonged to the unit. The deck emptied the way it always does, orderly then ordinary. That's the point of ceremony properly done. It gives a place for words to carry exactly as far as they should and no farther. The field held what had been said and let the rest blow clean downriver. By midweek, the wind had settled and the work returned to the pace the Corps trusts. That's when the administrative side did what it always does. Closed the loop with paper signatures and dates you can audit. The Inspector General sent up a medium-thick packet to my office with a transfer slip clipped to the corner. For awareness, read only. I opened it and went from the executive summary to the appendices in order. The conclusions were clear, dry, and fair administrative violations at the minor level. Repayment of the overage already completed, formal counseling recorded on the proper form, a period of internal monitoring, and mandatory refresher training on travel rules and government card use. No flourishes, just timelines and accountable names. In the middle of the packet sat 2 handwritten pages in a neat hand. The first was to the IG. She accepted responsibility for each point in the findings, committed to complete every corrective step, and asked to be reevaluated at the end of the monitoring window. The second was to Colonel Evan Price in his role as staff judge advocate. She thanked him for a transparent process, affirmed that she was not asking for any exemption, and requested permission to help host a rules refresher for her section so my mistake becomes the right kind of example. I set the letters aside, not to admire or to frame, just to acknowledge their place in the record. The counseling entry showed her immediate supervisor had conducted a face-to-face discussion with clear expectations and dates. The bank receipt confirming repayment was attached behind it. The remedial training block had been scheduled after hours. The monitoring plan named the responsible reviewer and the verification criteria, what would be checked when and by what evidence. Nothing in it made good copy. That's the point of process done well. If it's finished, the room gets quiet. If it isn't, you know exactly what's left. I signed, reviewed on the packet cover, noted the time. Handed it back to my admin clerk for filing and added no comment. Late that afternoon, walking past the duty desk between shifts, I caught a small square of yellow paper under the clear acrylic corner of the blotter. 4 words in black ink: earn it every day, no signature. I didn't pause, only slowed enough to be sure it would be hard to miss. That evening's internal traffic showed her next step, a properly routed request to volunteer for a field logistics rotation when she meets eligibility at the next cycle. The form was correct, the endorsements were blank because they're supposed to be until the time comes, and Human Resources marked it received with the simple note, "We'll evaluate when prerequisites are met." That's how doors get knocked on, by procedure, not by proximity. Public Affairs sent me a short line as well. External inquiries had been answered with the stock description of process. No names, no investigative detail. At the bottom of the message, the PAO linked the internal schedule for the newly added finance rules session taught jointly by SJA and IG. Ashley's section had signed up for the front row. I read it, shut the screen, and looked out at the parade field slipping into shade. A platoon was drilling at an honest pace, count steady feet together enough to make a sound you could measure. That rhythm, the work doing what it's meant to do, is the only confirmation I needed that we had put this where it belongs. No special lanes, no borrowed influence, just an error named, a correction mapped, and a review date written in a book. I closed the packet, locked it in the safe, and went back to the approvals that were waiting before any of this started. Near the end of my shift, I added one line to my own notebook, a habit I've kept since I wore a single bar. The system worked. Keep your hands off the wheel when it isn't your turn. Somewhere in a mess hall or a supply cage, a young Marine was wiping down a table, building a schedule, and sliding a small note under clear plastic so the next watch would see it. My role now was simple: let the procedure run all the way to the last box exactly as ordered. By week's end, the paperwork had done what it was built to do, and the base felt steady again. I signed what needed signing, closed the safe, and drove without an aide or a destination anyone else had to know. The road bent toward the river and then toward the rows of white stone that keep their own council. Quantico National Cemetery was quiet enough to hear the flag halyards tick against the poles. I parked at the bottom of the rise and walked the rest, reading names I knew and names I didn't. When you visit men you served with, you don't bring speeches. You bring your presence and something small to leave behind that says, "I was here and I remember." I had the coin in my pocket, the one pressed into my palm outside Fallujah on a day when we moved fast, wrong at first and then right. The crest was smoothed by years of trousers and the edge had lost its bite. I set it on the top of a headstone that still looked new, centered the insignia, and laid my hand flat for a beat. The stone had kept its chill. The sun hadn't been up long enough to warm it. I didn't say a prayer. I said a name, and that was enough. Tradition will tell you different coins mean different things. What mattered to me was plainer: a coin on a stone is a record of witness. It doesn't excuse anything, and it doesn't improve the dead. It holds the living to the promise they made when the work was loud and the air was bad. I turned back to the car, sat with the engine off until the cicadas found their volume, and then pointed the nose west. A few hours and 2 coffees later, I pulled into a small cemetery that has no map-only memory. The gate creaked like it had been waiting for a reason. Maggie's stone sits under a pecan tree that throws more shade than you'd guess from the trunk. I brought no flowers. My mother liked a clean kitchen and a paid bill more than bouquets, so I keep my visits plain. I took a quarter from my pocket, a common coin, nothing ceremonial, and set it heads up at the edge of the marker where the sun could find it. As I did, I saw there was already a coin there, tucked near the base where grass tries to reclaim what it can. Not a quarter. A worn silver dime with Roosevelt's profile almost rubbed smooth. Someone had been here before me and said their piece without a word. There are only a few someones who would have known to do that. I didn't pick it up. I didn't move it. I left both coins where they were, the ordinary and the older, side by side, like a ledger that finally balanced. I spoke to her the way a son talks to a woman who did the hard part without applause. I told her the work goes on. I told her some damage gets repaired in public because that's where it was done, and some gets repaired in private because that's the only place it will take. I told her I would keep my end of the bargain she never wrote down. Stand up straight, do what you said you would, and let the truth make its own noise. Before I left, I stood a little longer than habit requires and looked at the 2 coins. A life doesn't get erased because a man lifts a glass and says the wrong thing into a microphone. No one erases a life with a raised glass. Truth needs a person willing to stand up straight. If your turn comes, and it will find your feet and take the weight. Leave something small and earned on the stones you owe, and then walk away without fanfare. The wind had come up by then, enough to ruffle the grass and carry the smell of dry earth. I touched the top of the marker with 2 fingers. The way you touch a door frame on your way out of a house you mean to come back to, and headed for the car. The road home was the same road as always, which is the comfort of it. Some things we fix, some things we mark. The rest we shoulder and keep moving steady as a cadence you can count in your head. Thank you for staying to the end of Jack's story. If any part of it echoed your own being cut down by family, choosing to stand straight and let the truth carry its own weight, this channel is for you. I tell clean fight stories, real consequences, earned redemption, no screaming matches, no dirty payback. If that speaks to you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. I'd love to hear from you, especially viewers 55 and up. Should Jack have walked back into that wedding in his dress blues, or kept it entirely private for another day? Have you ever had to face down your own kin and choose discipline over noise? What did you do, and what did it cost you? Veterans share one rule or phrase that steadied you when the room got loud. Parents and grandparents, if you could hand a single sentence to a son or daughter before a hard confrontation, what would it be? Tell us where you're watching from, state, town, or post, so we can welcome you by name. And if Earn It Every Day resonates with you, write those words in the comments to let someone else know they're not standing alone. Finally, consider sharing this video with a friend who needs the reminder that dignity doesn't require a raised voice. Only a person willing to stand their ground and let the facts stand taller.